these CDs, Rosary, Cenacle CDs. They're beautiful CDs with the Sorrowful Mysteries played with 100 people, and various messages of Our Lady given to Father Gobby. Also Act of Consecration to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. We also have some of the copies still of the Visits to the Blessed Sacrament and the Blessed Virgin Mary by St. Alphonsus. We have begun, 6 o'clock, we began the 40 hours of continuous adoration in this church. Something that will bring an enormous blessing to the parish and to Queensland at this time, which is a very crucial time when so many of you have joined the procession last Saturday to pray for prevention of rather extreme abortion laws being passed in this state. So we pray, all these prayers that are going out here will be wonderful. I noticed when I had a look at it, there were just 3 hours, not yet with nobody there. One of them was a very easy hour, that was between the 2 masses on Sunday. So it's wonderful, and there were 3 names there at 6 o'clock, but there were actually 6 people here, and a 7th came for a short time. So, and I was there too, so you could say 8 of us began the adoration, but there were just 3 names there. So it's wonderful when Jesus is exposed there, other people can come in who can't stay for the full hour, but they can stay for a while with Jesus. So if you haven't put your name yet down for an adoration, put your name down on the board and fill in one of the slips. And on the slip there's another question saying that it says, yes, I'm willing to spend at least 1 hour with Jesus, who is truly present in the Blessed Sacrament on a more regular basis. What is recommended is once a week. So perhaps the hours of adoration can be increased in this parish from the ones that we have already, which is on Wednesday and then the first Friday night. I'll be available for reconciliation after the session tonight if anybody still hasn't received that. We only have the one collection during mission. We're going to have it now. So if those who are going to be the collectors could go around now, and we will have the collection to cover the expenses of mission. We aren't very good at raising money, but I'll tell you a story that happened there. This happened, of course, in a Protestant church. It wouldn't happen in a Catholic church. The church, the roof was getting deteriorating, and so the pastor asked the people to call a meeting and ask them to pledge money. There was an extremely wealthy man there who owned several supermarkets, and he put up his hand and said, "I'll give $5. Just at that moment, a piece of the roof fell down and clobbered him on the head. He got up straight away and said, "Oh, make that 50. And then one of the men was overheard saying, hit him again, Lord, hit him again." So watch out. Seems that the ceiling is fairly secure here. Right, we'll now stand up and we'll sing our hymn to Our Lady, and then I'll be talking to an adoration, so I'll expose the Blessed Sacrament again. I've got a picture of a church there. It's a church in Western Australia, in Geraldton, Bluff Point. And I have a story to tell you, a true story that I confirmed with the parish priest, who's a friend of mine, Father Brian Ahern. It happened, there was a woman in the parish, her name was Eileen, and she had some good friends who were Pentecostals, and she began to go to the Pentecostal church. at first, as well as going to Mass. She found in that church that there were a lot of things she liked. The people loved Jesus very much. They knew their scriptures. The preacher was very good. The singing was tremendous. They were very welcoming. And so she decided, look, I think I'm going to switch. I'm going to go over there to the Pentecostals. But because Father Brian had been good to her, she decided she'd go and say goodbye to him and explain what she'd decided to do. But what she forgot was that the night when she came to say goodbye to him happened to be Holy Thursday night. And she arrived just towards the end of the Mass, of the Last Supper. And if you've been to the Holy Thursday Mass, you know that after the Mass on Holy Thursday there is a procession to the altar of repose, and the Blessed Sacrament is carried around the church. Eileen was sitting in the back seat, and as the Blessed Sacrament came past her, something quite extraordinary happened. She felt an overwhelming, she called it like a tidal wave of love. And she heard a voice coming from the Blessed Sacrament, Eileen, I am here in my church. Do not leave my church. And I want you to help Father Brian establish perpetual adoration. So she waited for quite a long time because Father Brian was praying there after the Mass and the procession, and then went around to see him. And of course, she didn't tell him she was going to leave the Catholic Church. She told him about the extraordinary experience that she had had of God's wonderful presence and love for her. It's a treasure that we have in our church. Pope John Paul II quotes Blessed Paul VI, soon to be Saint Paul VI next month, says the special presence is called real. We call it the real presence, not as a way of excluding other types of presence as if they were not real. You know, Jesus is present in many ways. He is present every Sunday when they gather in the Protestant churches or the Pentecostal churches. Jesus is present because they've gathered in his name. While they are praising and singing to him and praying to him, he's there with them. But of course, when they leave the church, what is there? It's no different from any hall, any public hall. But when we leave the church, Jesus is still truly, really present. So Paul VI says it's called a real presence, not in the way of excluding other types of presence as if they were not real, but because it is a presence in the fullest sense, a substantial presence whereby Christ, the God-man, is wholly and entirely present. And he quotes, John Paul quotes St. Thomas Aquinas, before this mystery of love, human reason fully experiences its limitations. So it is something that if Jesus is truly present in our churches, it's a great pity if there is nobody there, because he is there for us. Pope John Paul II was the one who tried to promote very much perpetual adoration. He said these words in 1981. The church and the world have a great need for Eucharistic devotion. Jesus waits for us in this sacrament of love. Let us be generous in our time, going to meet him in adoration and in contemplation full of faith, and ready to make reparation for the great faults and crimes of the world. May our adoration never cease. At the time that he wrote those words in his letter to Dominici in 1981, he established a chapel of perpetual adoration in St. Peter's in Rome. If any of you have been to St. Peter's in recent years, most of St. Peter's is like any tourist attraction, people going around, taking photos, looking at the wonderful statues and so on. But there is that side chapel, beautiful big chapel, in which the Blessed Sacrament is permanently exposed day and night in the monstrance. And to go into that chapel, there are guards there to prevent people going in unless they are going in to pray. It's a place of prayer. During the day, anybody can go there. During the night, there are nuns who pray there. So he established perpetual adoration there in St. Peter's. And he went to promote this then around the world. I've been going to Indonesia for many years. And in Indonesia, it's hard for Australians to comprehend the difference between Australia and Indonesia. Indonesia is the most religious country in the world. Australia is one of the least religious countries in the world. When I give a retreat in Indonesia, I get at least 1,000 people. If you don't get 1,000 people, you'd wonder. There was one place we didn't get 1,000 people because the parish priest went off on a holiday and didn't promote it. But everywhere else, you expect 1,000, 1,500, 5,000 people to come if you're having a retreat, and they're 2 full days. So everywhere we went, in Indonesia, Father Doug Harris and I, we established these chapels of perpetual adoration. There's a picture of one of them. That one there would hold, it's quite long, it's hold about 80 people probably. There have been times when it's been full. And there have been people waiting outside to go in to fulfill their hour. There's a big school nearby, Catholic high school, and the teachers bring in the students for half an hour regularly to pray there. So when we have perpetual adoration, and during this 40 hours, some people have to do night adoration. And that's more of a sacrifice, to come during the middle of the night to do adoration. One of the things that happened there in this place, Malvere, where that chapel is, there was a man who was a wealthy businessman. He owned he was the main owner of a university plus other business. And he made a promise that he would do 2 a.m. to 3 a.m. each Monday evening. But after a few months, he got lazy and he stopped doing it. Then about a year later, he lost a very important government document, which if he couldn't find it, he would lose his registration, he would lose all his businesses, all his wealth. And he searched and tried everything to find it, and he couldn't find it. And then one Monday night he woke up about 1:30, and he suddenly remembered, this is the time I promised that I would be with Jesus. And so he got up and he went to the Adoration Chapel. The moment he walked in and looked at the monstrance, it came clearly to his mind where was the document, and he saved his business. So he committed himself very strongly after that. And when I went back there just about 3 years ago, some years later, he was the coordinator, he was in charge of the whole adoration, perpetual adoration, responsible for the whole thing. And because I wasn't able to stay in the bishop's house on that occasion, but had to stay in the seminary, which was some distance away, he gave me one of his vehicles and one of his drivers, he was a wealthy man, for my use the whole time I was there. So I could go to and fro whenever I liked. So it's... when we make a promise to the Lord, He likes us to keep it. And if we do keep it, He's going to bless us so much, so very abundantly. Well, I'm talking about Indonesia. I'll just tell you another story. I was going to tell some of these stories on the Sunday Masses, but we have to listen to the Archbishop's homily this Sunday because he's for the fundraising, so I can't tell these stories. But I'll tell you another story, and this is an amazing story, and it really motivates people. That's why when I tell these stories, a lot of people sign up for perpetual adoration. This, he was a young man, about 30 years old, Chinese Indonesian, and he heard me preaching and telling people to commit themselves to 1 hour a week with the Lord, 1 hour of adoration every week, and that there would be great blessings that would come through this. But he thought to himself, when he heard this, he thought, well, look, there's no way I could do that because I've got my own business and my business is really struggling. I've got 3 little boys and a wife, so he would put it out of his mind. But sometime after that, he was travelling past the Adoration Chapel. It was just opposite the cathedral, and it was in a convent of nuns, actually. And he decided to have a look and see it. As he arrived, his best friend was coming out, another young Chinese businessman who also had 3 kids. And this friend told him that, he was getting so much out of this, and he committed himself, and he was doing this hour. So he decided, all right, if he can do it, I'll start myself. But as soon as he started to do his adoration every week, his wife got very ill. She got more and more serious. All doctors tried to do something about it. Nothing worked. They couldn't find out what was wrong with her, and it looked as though she was going to die. His name was Rainier. So in desperation, Rainier carried his wife into the chapel of adoration and pleaded with Jesus, heal my wife. And the instant miracle occurred. She was instantly healed, to the amazement of the doctors. So Rainier was so pleased that he had published a lot of little booklets for people to use during adoration, and he made a promise that he would not only do 1 hour of adoration a week, but 1 hour every day. So he began to do 1 hour every day, Monday to Saturday before his work, and on Sunday in the evening. Now I was back there a couple of years later, and this time Rainier invited me and Father Doug, who was with me, to his house for lunch. His house was desperately poor. There was a dirt floor, only a dirt floor, it was very small. And I had a meal with his wife and his 3 little boys. And then he came afterwards, he said, come and see something. I want to show you something. He showed us this new house that was nearly finished, beautiful house that he was building. He said, ever since I started to do daily adoration, my business took off. And so I regard this house for my family as the fruit of my adoration. He also went with me to the Adoration Chapel and with his 3 little boys, and they were about 10 and 9 and 7, something like that. And what so impressed me was the beautiful spirit of adoration these little boys had. And when they were leaving the chapel, it wasn't a great big place like this, they went out backwards so as not to turn their back on Jesus. So they had so much faith, so much devotion. He instilled that into his little children. Should we be surprised at a story like this? Didn't Jesus say, seek first? Why worry about what you are to eat, what you are to wear, how you are to be clothed, and so on? Seek first the kingdom of God, and these other things will be given to you. Well, certainly that Rainier experienced that. And his example, which I invited him to come with me and to share this story in other places. And I've shared this story many times because it's a wonderful story, and it shows how Jesus looks after us when we give him the first place in our lives. And one wonderful way of giving him the first place is, of course, to do adoration. And that hour a week is the wonderful thing. Now, with regard to Mother Teresa now, she said in our congregation we used to have adoration once a week for 1 hour. And then in 1973, so it's a long time ago, we decided to have adoration 1 hour every day. We have much work to do. Our homes for the sick and the dying destitute are full everywhere. Well, you'd think she'd say the opposite. Well, we can't afford to be spending time here. We've got to get out and do our work. But she saw it the opposite way. And And from the time we started having adoration every day, our love for Jesus became more intimate, our love for each other more understanding, our love for the poor more compassionate, and we've doubled the number of vocations. God has blessed us with many wonderful vocations. Some people have the objection that, well, why should we be spending this time in the church? We should be out doing good to others. I was many years in Perth, 12 years I had under Archbishop Hickey, a wonderful holy man. And he was invited to represent the bishops of Oceania at an international Eucharistic Congress that was held in Mexico. And he spoke at that Congress, and one of the things he said, he's a great promoter of adoration. In fact, I told you about Father Brian Ahern in Geraldton wanting to start perpetual adoration. Archbishop Hickey was the Bishop of Geraldton then, and he used to do night hours regularly himself during that perpetual adoration. Now, he said these words in his address in Mexico: "Serving others in love is one of the most precious fruits of the Eucharist. We cannot therefore be indifferent to the sufferings of those who are our brothers and sisters in Christ. The Eucharist therefore urges us to look beyond our own spiritual nourishment to the plight of people who are in need. Christians, strengthened by the Eucharist, need to be in the front line in serving the poor, the homeless, the persecuted, and the rejected people of the world. And let us commit ourselves not only to serve those in need, but also to draw them into the very life of Christ. They're not simply to be the objects of our charity, but they're to be offered the joys of knowing Christ." And his own life was an extraordinary example of that. He was a man of great prayer, very devoted to adoration, but he was extraordinary in his charity and work, particularly for the Aboriginals. He did an enormous amount for them. He allowed them to live on his veranda. He fed them. He did their funerals. He did their baptisms. He lobbied governments so they could have legal system, legal aid place and housing. Many things he did for them. And so he was not just saying this, but he lived it himself. So Jesus invites you, could you not watch 1 hour with me? That's what he said to the apostles in the Garden of Gethsemane. And he really says that to us. Could you not watch 1 hour with me? And he promises to bless us. Come to me, all you who labour and are overburdened, and I will give you rest. So when we are kind of harassed and troubled and things are overwhelming us, we can look to different ways of kind of relaxing and escaping the problems. So we could go down to the pokies and sit there. We could turn to alcohol. We could sit and watch the television set or whatnot. But none of these things are really going to lift us out of our depression and out of our burdens. But if we come and spend the time with Jesus, He will lift our burdens. He will give us the rest and the strength that we need. One of the great evangelists of the last century was Archbishop Fulton Sheen of the United States. I think many of you are old enough to remember him. He came to Australia and drew very big crowds. And in his later years, after he retired as a bishop, he spent his time giving retreats, especially to priests, mainly to priests, but to others too. And because I give a lot of retreats to priests, I've listened to his talks. And there's one thing that he says in every talk. You might say he's boring because he never finishes a talk without repeating this one thing, saying there is one resolution you must make during this retreat, and that is to spend an hour for priests, he says, every day, for lay people every week, priests and religious every day. an hour with Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament. And for perpetual, 1 hour a week for lay people, 1 hour a day for priests and religious. Now I've given you, St. Alphonsus Liguori is the founder of the Redemptorists. So in the letter of Pope John Paul II on the Eucharist, there's a particular phrase, a particular paragraph in it, which is very delightful for a Redemptorist. Pope John Paul is encouraging everyone to worship the Eucharist outside of Mass. He says the worship of the Eucharist outside of the Mass is of inestimable value to the life of the Church. Excuse me. This worship is strictly linked to the celebration of the Eucharistic sacrifice. It is the responsibility of pastors to encourage, also by their personal witness, the practice of Eucharistic adoration and exposition of the Blessed Sacrament in particular, as well as prayer of adoration before Christ present under the Eucharistic species. And he gives his little personal testimony. He says, "It is so pleasant to spend time with him, to lie close to his breast like the beloved disciple St. John, and to feel the infinite love present in his heart. How often, dear brothers and sisters, have I myself experienced this and drawn from it strength, consolation and support." He used to be always drawn to the Blessed Sacrament. They say he sometimes went missing on his trips abroad. He'd slip away. Well, the place where they find him would be before the Blessed Sacrament. He'd sneak away to be with Jesus. And then he says, this practice of adoration, repeatedly praised and recommended by the magisterium of the Church, is supported by the example of many saints. And this is the part that I love. Particularly outstanding among the saints in this regard was St. Alphonsus Liguori, who wrote, "Of all devotions, that of adoring Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament is the greatest after the sacraments, the one dearest to God and the one most helpful to us." And those of you who were quick enough to get the full version, the $10 one, that is there in the introduction. The ones that we have still left are a little bit abridged, but they still have beautiful words from St. Alphonsus, so they are worth having. This one and the smaller one. But he is the one that Pope John Paul II is outstanding among the saints. And in those books you see his prayers, what he said when he was in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament. I want to tell you about the transformation of a parish. One of the priests who did the retreat, actually it was in that place where I showed you the photo of the Adoration Chapel, Mount Mary. He, during the priest retreat, I always get the priest to have overnight adoration one night. The second last night or the last night, we have them rostered to do overnight adoration. And this priest, Father Quinn, he, Quiridas, his name, but they call him Quinn, he gave a testimony 3 years later when I was back giving another retreat to the priests there. He gave his testimony. He said, when he was there in the middle of the night with Jesus, Jesus showed him that he'd been a priest for 13 years and he was not a good priest. He's very humble in his sharing. He said, I was committing sins, serious and not serious. I was escaping all the time from my responsibilities. I was easily getting angry with the people. After Mass, they would go away with my anger in their hearts rather than the peace of Christ. And there were many things that he shared this. His life was not good. Jesus showed him when he was there. So he made the promise, interestingly, he made a double promise that he would pray every day before Jesus, but he also prayed that he would establish perpetual adoration in his parish, which wasn't a big parish. Anyway, excuse me, I'm sorry. Anyway, what happened was that some months later, about 9 months later, people who've been going, this had been going on for about 3.5 years, people had been going from his parish to the cathedral parish in order to do their scheduled adoration. So there was a deputation to him from members of the Legion of Mary and the Charismatic Renewal. They came to him and they said, "Look, Father, we're making all this journey to the cathedral to do our adoration. Do you think we could have perpetual adoration here?" And he said his heart jumped with joy because he'd been praying that this would happen. He didn't know how it would be possible. So then he went around the whole parish. They have in those places, like Indonesia, these small Christian communities, groups of families. And there were 27 of them in his parish. So he spent the month of May going around each evening to these 27 groups and motivating them to do an hour of adoration every week and then listing them up for the adoration. And so within a short time he was able to establish perpetual adoration in his parish. And then he shares, I got permission from the bishop to take him with me for other priest retreats and other retreats that I gave in the island of Flores. And so I heard his testimony a number of times. His own priesthood changed radically once he began to do adoration. And another thing was, of course, that the people in the parish changed. Their attention at Mass was quite different now. Of course, the way he was saying Mass would have been quite different too. The men used to go out during the sermon to have a smoke. The men all smoke still in Indonesia. But he said after they started doing adoration, they'd be waiting, and I suppose his sermons were much better too. A lot of people used to walk straight out after communion. So now they were waiting till the end of Mass. He found that he looked at around the parish, found there were 43 couples living together without marriage. And then he saw these people are coming to adoration, so he decided to arrange a marriage preparation and a Mass wedding. And every single couple in the parish joined in. So by the end of that marriage preparation and that wedding ceremony, there wasn't a single couple in the parish that wasn't married in the sacrament. And then another extraordinary thing that happened was in these local areas there, people lived for generations in the same little town. And therefore conflicts between families can last from one generation to the next. There were two families there that had nothing to do with each other for generations. And about a year after the adoration began, he was invited to one of these homes. And to his amazement, these two families had gathered together. And they said, "This is our night of reconciliation." They had been doing adoration, and God had touched their hearts. So it is wonderful what happens when a parish starts to do adoration. And in other places around, particularly because most of my promotion of adoration has been in Indonesia. I've done it there for 12 years in many different places all over the country. So many of the fruits that I've seen have been there. There have been so many miracles of healing. The first place where we established perpetual adoration in Indonesia was in a hospital, the St. Vincent de Paul Hospital in Surabaya. A very big hospital with 2,200 patients and staff, 90% of whom were Muslims. But the nuns gave us the chapel to begin the adoration because the permanent chapel had not yet been completed. So we began there, and of course, it's dangerous to let Jesus near the sick, isn't it? You know what he did when he was on earth, and a hospital was full of sick people. So sick people began to come to this chapel, and of course the majority of them were Muslim because the most of the people there were Muslim. And they were being healed. Wonderful. They have to have a guard. Salaries are very low there. They can afford to keep a guard. In some places, like Surabaya, they need a guard to overnight at the Adoration Chapel. And the guard was talking about these wonderful things that he'd seen there, healings of Muslims and Catholics. And of course there's changes of attitude, there are healing of marriages. I could talk about a couple there in Perth. I went to the first anniversary of the setting up of a virtual adoration chapel there, and a couple got up and talked about some of the wonderful things that had happened. But afterwards the husband came around and said, well, there's some things we couldn't speak about publicly, but one of the things was that we were almost on the point of splitting up. But then we decided we were recruited to do the adoration. We did it at different times. But as we did regular adoration, we began to communicate again with each other, and now, and this is 12 months later, you could say we've fallen in love again. So these things happen. Some other miraculous answers to prayer. There was a seminary that didn't have any water, was desperately short of water. The seminarians and the staff did 9 days of an hour of adoration before the Blessed Sacrament, and at the end of the 9 days they discovered a wonderful source of water. And in the same place there was a boy who was about 12 years old who had never been able to speak. So the mother, hearing what happened in the seminary, she brought the boy for 9 days, and they did an hour of adoration together, and the child spoke and was healed. So Jesus is really here. So we must expect that what he did on earth when he was around, he will do it here also, because he's here, he's really here. So Pope Francis is calling us today to grow in holiness and saying that every single one of us who's baptized is called to be holy. So through adoration, we get to know Jesus as a friend. We have a place to turn to in every need, because he says to us, come to me, all you who labor and are heavily burdened, and I will give you rest. So we will have a blessing with the Blessed Sacrament. So the theme will be the Blessed Mother, of course, tomorrow. And adoration then continues not only overnight tonight, but all day tomorrow. We have the Mass then at 6 p.m. and then it continues after the Mass through until the 7 a.m. Mass. And then there's still an hour of adoration between 8 and 9. It's wonderful to see the big number of names there. So if your name's not there yet, or if you'd like to add to it, you put your name there and fill in one of the slips. So we have our final hymn now.